another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I'm your hostess, Caitlin, and I have 20 plus years experience within sewing and 12 plus years experience within living history as a hobby and profession. This podcast explores things like myth debunking, historic wardrobes, clothing, all of that sort of fun stuff. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you would consider subscribing and following along. So last time I answered 20 questions about how I got into living history and then basically a little bit about me in general. And today we're going to go back into history and look at how the basic 19th century chemise came from the 18th century shift, all the terms, and how the styles changed from about 1750 to the 1880s. And part of this is because I see a lot of people who say underwear doesn't really change much, and so they try to document the same chemise they're wearing in 1840 for 1880 or vice versa or whatever. And that's just not how things actually go. Now it is undergarments, so if you as a living historian only have one type of basic undergarment, you're not showing anyone anything, yeah, go ahead and wear it underneath. That saves you time and money. But anywhere where people might see anything, you definitely need to have something very correct. And it's nice to know the styles so you're not giving people incorrect information about when they're just starting out. I only want to do 1860s. Don't show them an 1880 style chemise. These are garments that are very frequently washed and used, and so they don't last as long as people think that they will. So without any further ado, let's get started. Let's begin with what is a shift or a chemise. So these are basic underwear garments. Typically they are white, so like printer paper white, and they are typically a plant-based fiber, either linen or cotton or a blend of the two. They also somewhat resemble a nightgown to our modern eye. These are garments that a lady would put on first, so before anything else. They are basic undergarments. It goes right next to the skin and then other layers are piled on top of it. This means that a shift or chemise must be very comfortable, given that it's going to touch our skins for a long period of time. It also needs to be able to soak up body oils and sweat, etc. And so today, again, we're going to explore how this garment changes through time to give ourselves a better understanding of what shape is right for each time period. Because no, they are not actually interchangeable. So for pre-1820, I'm going to rely a little bit more on other people's research, which I don't typically like to do, and I will credit them when I get to that point, because I am just starting my 18th century research for events that I am attending later this year. This is a brand new time period for me. It's not something that I really know anything about. So I am kind of still in that era of looking at other people's research that I know who have done a really good job and kind of picking out their original sources and going back to them from there. It's an interesting change from what I usually do in the 19th century, where I know what to pull because I've been in the 19th century for so long. So for the mid-18th century, I have found that Sharon Bernstein is an excellent like-minded researcher, and she has handled original garments, she has drafted some of those original garments and made those patterns available for free. So she seems to have that same mindset that I have, that research should be free and accessible, and also we need to get as close to the originals as humanly possible. So Mrs. Bernstein unfortunately passed away a few years back, but she leaves behind a wealth of research for free online, which I greatly appreciate. So Mrs. Bernstein has a pattern for an 1752 shift in her private collection, which I will likely be copying for my own. Someone else other than myself who would have more thorough information on the 18th century is welcome to put their thoughts and knowledge in the comments. But because I'm just starting out the 18th century, I want to include a little bit of what I am learning, even though this isn't my area of expertise yet. So based on my very limited research, I can see that most 18th century style shifts appear to be linen, which does make sense because this is before the big cotton boom. Linen is strong, it's hard wearing, it soaks up sweat and body oils and still feels dry to the touch. It usually feels cool to the touch, so it's great for hot weather. There's just so many excellent reasons why one would choose linen for a basic undergarment. So all shifts do seem to be white, which makes sense as white is very easy to launder and to keep clean. There's no pesky natural dyes that'll fade unevenly or crock off on your skin or give irritation or whatever. Just put a little bit of bluing in the rinse spot and then hang them to dry and bleach in the sun and you're good to go. As for style, I see the mid-18th century shifts being very economically made without much fabric waste. The shift is one piece, it's folded in half, so it's like a giant thing that's literally folded, which makes sense because the word chemise actually does mean folder, I think in French, is what I've been told. But this is before that term actually comes into play. So the shift is one giant piece, it's folded in half, and you cut out a neckline by which you make your underarm gussets, and then you kind of slice down the front a little bit, and you flip those upside down and make gores at the bottom so you have more room at the bottom, and of course your top is a little bit narrower. So as far as all the extents I have seen scooped necklines in this time period, which I found was interesting because in 1820 they're very much square. And so it's interesting to see how it changed from a scoop neckline to more very square to a little bit more of that scooped look, but in a different way later in the 19th century. I like to see how styles ebbed and flowed and how things come back, but they come back in different ways. It's always just fascinating to me. So again, with that scooped neck, again, we see the gussets cut from the excess, but I also see that the back is scooped out a little less than the front. The front's a little bit more, which typically makes sense even to us modern people. Usually our necklines are a little bit lower in front than they are in back. Mid 18th century shifts do tend to have sleeves to the elbow that I've noticed, at least to the elbow, or just like thereabouts-ish. And more often than not, I see them with a little bit of drawstring at the arm. And these sleeves seem to be very, at least in the sense, they're not like super duper billowy like bishop sleeves, but they are moderately full. So now we know our starting point. How does this basic garment change? We have our basic garments, and we're going to see how that changes throughout the years. So somewhere in the 1770 to 1780 range, there's a slight shift in the shift design. Sleeves become narrower, which means not as gathered, so a little bit more fitted. And I don't see them drawstring anymore, which makes sense because they're more fitted. They are also getting shorter, ever so slightly, above the elbow in most cases, but I still see primarily scooped necks. The basic construction has not changed other than a very few small details, but even though these details are small, they do still change the look of the garment enough to where I think for living history purposes, it would be hard substituting one for the other, at least at this point in my research, especially with the sleeve design. A very helpful resource on shifts and all garments in this time period would be 1789's Instructions for Cutting Out Apparel for the Poor, principally intended for the assistance of the patronesses of Sunday schools and other charitable institutions, but useful in all families, with a preface containing a plan for assisting the parents of poor children to clothe them, published for the benefit of the Sunday school children at Herdingford Berry, which does seem to be the late 18th century version of the Workwoman's Guide, which I do appreciate. And yes, that is the entire title of the book. I thought it was hilarious. That's very normal for this era in literature, even up into the mid-19th century. Very, very long titles. Like, titles are essentially a paragraph, and I think it's hilarious. So yes, I do have to read the entire title. I feel like a decent title for that whole thing we just read would be Instructions for Cutting Out Garments for the Poor. Like, the first little section, that's a great title, and the rest of it was just, I read it for fun. But it does have several patterns for shifts and other garments as well. There's very few drawings, so you basically have to read it from the directions. So you basically have to figure it out from the written directions, which I'm not very good at, but I will try. And I'm looking forward to reading more of the source in detail, even though it's later than what we'll likely be doing in the 1770s. So I probably won't use it as much, but it might be a good source to get me the basic dimensions right so I can use the earlier shapes. So from what I can tell, this basic style does stay the same until about 1815 or so, but the only major change that I see is I notice the sleeves are getting steadily shorter. Somewhere in the 18 teens, I'd start to see the squared neckline appear, but you still will occasionally see the scoops. It is also around this time in the 18 teens that we start seeing a term change. The word shift morphs into the French word for the same article, the chemise. Jane Austen writes in a letter to Caroline Austen in 1870, quote, "But nothing offends me so much as the absurdity as not being able to pronounce the word shift. I could forgive her any follies in English, rather than that mock modesty of that French word," end quote. So apparently some women decided to become a little bit squeamish around the word shift because it's such a basic garment. And they moved to the French word for a little bit of delicacy and also for fashionability because French is very fashionable. So clearly you can see Miss Austen's opinions about this concept of the word change. The word shift does hang on and off for a good couple of years, at least to the 1840s, where the word is more or less replaced by the word chemise entirely. They aren't different garments. They are literally an earlier term and a later term with some overlap in the very early beginning of the 19th century. So going back to how they've constructed, towards 1820, shifts are sometimes made up as two separate pieces joined with shoulder straps. I have an original shift in this style and I've recreated it on the channel. For those interested, I will link the video above. And at this point, we also see the introduction of puffed sleeves, which is an option with the straight sleeves. So you can choose either or. This style sticks through the 1820s, and then in the mid 1830s, we get another change, and this time it is a pretty major change. A band is beginning to be put straight across the front and the back of the chemise. Sometimes these bands are separate from the shoulder straps, so it's 4 pieces. You have, well, more than that. You have the straight chemise body with a shoulder strap, and that's just gathered in for the earlier style, and then you start seeing a band put on, so that ends up being 2 shoulder straps and 2 bands. And then in the late 1830s, you start seeing them being cut as 1 piece. So it's still a square, but it's a square yoke all of a sudden. Which makes sense because that is less sewing. If you're going to do a band, if that's the current style, the next logical step is to attach these 2 pieces, cut them as 1, so that you no longer have to do the extra sewing, because this is still before sewing machines, so that is extra steps that you don't necessarily need to take. These chemises still do have that square neck, which has been so popular since the 1820s. It also seems that you can get away with your earlier 1820s styles for chemises, though, because the Workwoman's Guide of 1838 does publish very Regency looking shifts, and she does call them shifts in that book, and the Lady of the Workman's Guide does publish the folded version without the shoulder seams at the top, and also a version with the shoulder seams. Around this time period as well, we also see the option for the bibbed chemise, which is meant to go over the corset to help alleviate any bumps from the boob to corset, and create a very smooth finished silhouette for the dress to lay over top. It is an optional style, but it is one that stays through the early 1840s. So now at this point, people are pretty much married to the yoked chemise by the early 1840s. So we are no longer seeing the folded under with the drawstring. We're seeing very fitted yokes, and then the chemise body itself is gathered into those yokes. Because you don't want necessarily all the bulk here, you need it to be fitted here, but you need a lot of space for boobage and hips and all of that fun stuff. So having something that's gathered is still very much wanted, but it's fitted on a very fitted yoke, so that you don't have the bulk up here. And then in the mid-1840s, we begin to see what I refer to as the typical mid-19th century chemise style. So almost always now referred to as a chemise at this point. We see that the square yokes of the 1830s have moved into rounded yokes. Yes, kind of the rounded look from the 18th century is coming back, but it's coming back in form of a yoked style, as opposed to just scooping out the neck. And that style is here to stay. But again, it is different because it is a yoked round neckline. So you see how fashion kind of does that. It's one of those things where if I change one thing, I didn't copy my neighbor's homework. We bring the thing back, but we make it just different enough so we're not copying them. And also to make things very difficult for future living historians. And I'm telling you, that had to be a reason sometimes, just to make things difficult for us. And they did it to mess with us. I don't actually think that. It was mostly just for fashion reasons, but I like to think that sometimes. These yoke necklines are just a straight, round yoke. I know that didn't make any sense, but wait until you see the yoke styles of the 1850s and 60s. It might make a little bit more sense, I promise. Which would have been the case for chemises and shifts up to this point. You would have had a narrow tape being inserted into the neckline to draw things up. Originally, it was all the way around, and then once you start getting the shoulder straps, it's just across the front and across the back. And that's what we use, again, to help it fit up here, but still be full enough to accommodate bodies down here. But now we don't need the drawstring because we're just gathering our chemise into a band. And for a decade, this characterized a very straight and fitted sleeves. I see a lot of puffed sleeve chemises in the 1840s, which is very odd to me. Why this chemise style of puffed sleeves stayed, whereas we're having very fitted outer sleeves. I feel like that would, at least in some cases, make it a little bit bulky up here. But I see images and I don't see bulkiness, so I don't know if it was over the slightly, not as fitted sleeves in the 1840s if we're wearing the puff sleeves, and otherwise we're choosing the straight sleeve. But yes, this is also the point in time where straight sleeves become a little bit more fashionable as well. This is also the time period, this mid-1840s, where we see the chemise shift again from being primarily linen before this point to primarily cotton later in the 19th century. So this is where we start getting, some of them are linen, some of them are cotton. Most of them are still linen at this point. About half and half, it seems, are linen and cotton. You also see cotton-linen blends. That is also appropriate. Cotton is king in this time period, especially in the US. I do find linen more often in this time period in the UK specifically, but cotton about 50-50 in America. So let's briefly touch on fabric since we're kind of talking about it anyway. A nice medium weight linen is great for shifts and chemises. For cotton, what they used in the period was called longcloth, which we no longer have access to today. It is a long fiber cotton cloth that is very sturdy. It's light, but it's very opaque, so not see-through, or you can't see shadows underneath or anything. It is extremely opaque, but still very light and airy, and it is extremely hard wearing. Long cloth, again, no longer exists. The closest we have that I've seen people say is close is Pimatex cotton, which you can still buy, especially if like Dharma Trading sells it. I don't find it a great approximation of long cloth. There's a lot of differences, but it still does have that opaque but light and airy feel, so that at least is similar. The look is different in my opinion. Long cloth, Pimatex cotton is very smooth, and long cloth tends to have a little bit more, they're called slubs. Some of the threads are a little bit thicker than other threads. That linen look, long cloth has a tendency to be a little bit more like that. Also, the threads themselves tend to be a little bit thicker than what Pimatex uses, which is a very thin thread in the cloth. But it is a very decent approximation. And for the fact that we can no longer get long cloth, yeah, I would use Pimatex if you want to get super close. Otherwise, a high thread count cotton would be a decent approximation. Rock Ion used to sell a fantastic bleached cotton cloth that was super cheap. It was like $3 a yard, like 5 years ago. It was really good quality, and it wasn't thick. It wasn't quite as thick as long cloth, but it was a really good approximation, and I cannot find it for sale anymore. It only sold in 50-yard bolts, and my best underpinnings come from those bolts. I bought like 3 bolts, so I have a lot of petticoats. And I probably should cut down to chemises because they are much nicer as chemises, and I can use the crappy cloth we get now for petticoats that aren't against my skin. But yeah, I really miss getting that fabric. It was really good fabric. But going back to shifts and chemises, they are bleached white. Not natural for most impressions. Occasionally you can find references to that, but vast majority of them are going to be white, like printer paper white. It's easier to keep clean, it's easier to look fresh. I understand it doesn't look old to our modern eyes because people like to think that the yellow look is old. That's just because they've been sitting for 150 years. I still have originals that are like stark printer paper white. I also have some originals that have been yellowed because they were not stored properly. But even those, if I were to wash them, which I won't because I don't want to harm them, if I were to wash them, they would be printer paper white because I used to do that before I knew better. So yes, they are all printer paper white. So again, I know that cream or off-white looks right to us, but that's because the natural age-related wearing on the originals is not what the original garments looked like 160 years ago. And we're not trying to recreate what the garment looks like now. We're trying to recreate what it looked like when it was first made. So originally they would have been white, so let's stick to white. Anyway, this style does stick around to the mid-1850s when we start seeing the introduction of what I refer to as the shaped yoke, which is a totally made-up term by me, okay? So by now the yokes are still typically straight in the back, and by straight I just mean they're one solid curved piece, but it's not shaped in any way. And then in the front, the yoke goes straight around the neckline, but down here it kind of frames the bosoms a little bit, so it just goes over the breast just slightly, and that's where you see the fullness of the gathers. And then the yoke kind of comes down, and you usually have 3 buttons to close it. I've seen 1 button before, and there are no other buttonholes, so I know it was a single button. But typically it's 3 buttons. So very often these yokes are very heavily embroidered. And this sometimes may be done by the wearer. I know Peterson's magazine in 1859 has a pattern to embroider one, but most often these pieces were done by some very poorly paid person and sold to be made up. So okay, this is how this works. All right, I'm going to give you a rundown of how this works. So a length of fabric is sent to an embroiderer who embroiders the yoke and sleeves pieces directly onto the length of fabric. They could also do drawers and nightgowns and negligees in the same way, and you could get all 4 garments in the same embroidery design as a matching set. That was often done for trousseaux, your wedding trousseaux, that sort of thing. Then that length of fabric with the yoke and sleeves embroidered on are sent to the shop to be sold. So a lady comes into the shop to purchase a chemise. She's handed a length of cloth. Yes, she will tell the shopkeeper, I am here to purchase a chemise. I would like to purchase a chemise. And in our modern brains, yes, we like to think of she's purchasing a finished chemise. That is not how this works. She is buying the length of fabric that is cut to make a chemise. So it's cut to the proper length. It is embroidered, for the yoke, whatever she wants, whether that's sometimes the tucks are done, sometimes it's just embroidery applied. Sometimes it's tucks and other decorations, but typically it's going to be embroidery. And so she is handed a length of cloth, she pays, then she goes home and either cuts out and makes up the garment herself, or of course gives it to her dressmaker who does it for her. So no embroidery required by the purchaser. Once machine embroideries come out in the mid-1850s, the poorly paid embroiderers are really out of a job. They do stick around for a while, but yeah, they can't really compete with how cheaply and quickly machines can embroider. So they do get replaced. It's the same system though. So the yoke and the sleeves are embroidered at one end, and then the maker just cuts them up and sews up the chemise, and she can make it however long or short she wants. There's a little bit of extra fabric for like length situations, and she cuts up the chemise and sews it with whatever fabric length she was given. So super simple. Sometimes you have issues where the embroidery doesn't quite fit you. So most often I see this in the cases of it's a kind of a wider set. It's meant for a person with a larger frame. And so what I see on originals is a lot of times in the center back, and sometimes right at the armpits on either side, there'll be a little tuck taken in the embroidery, which is one of the reasons that we know that these garments are not being made for the wearer. They are being mass marketed for, whatever sizes. And so you see the tuck taken, and it's kind of a dart almost, so where you see all the embroidery on the bottom, there's no tuck, but then at the top there's a little bit of a tuck. You also occasionally see where the whole embroidery in the center back just has a seam right down it. That's because the yoke was just too big for the person, and so she cut it down entirely. And so there will be a little break in the embroidery where that seam is for that. It wasn't done specifically for that person. It was purchased ready-made, essentially, ready embroidered, and then you fit it to yourself afterwards, which does somewhat make sense to me. I think my current understanding, and I haven't seen exactly how this works out, I haven't found primary documentation for it, but collar and cuff set were also sold embroidered, and you would cut them out and just make up the collar and cuffs. And those, from what I understand, are sold in neck sizes, like you can do a 12-inch neck or a 14-inch neck or whatever. And that does make sense because when I look at originals of those, I don't see the tucks being taken. So those are a little bit more fitted. I don't know why it wouldn't be the same way for chemises and nightgowns and such, but I haven't found evidence of that, and I do see the tucks and such being taken in those garments. So it seems like those are not size. It's just, here's an embroidered yoke, you like this embroidery pattern, take it home, fit it to yourself. Whereas collars, I guess because they're smaller, it's easier to make several of them in different sizes, I guess is how that works. But I haven't actually found, again, documentation of that specifically. So in my personal collection, I have a chemise that has just a straight seam down that yoke, so it was much too big for the wearer. And I assume she probably took some off at the neckline as well to make it fit, because there was no tucks on the front whatsoever. Either that, or she's just a very small frame person with a very large bust, and so she needed the extra space in the front and she didn't need it in the back. That's an option. And then I have an original negligee, which has a small tuck taken at the very back of the neck. It's not even a tuck, it's like a dart. And it's just about 2 or 3 inches long. That is not to say that you don't see the straight yokes at all. By the late 1850s, they still do stick around into the 1860s, but I see them more or less replaced by the yoked styles. They do seem to be more popular. And again, weird things go in and out of fashion. So there was a brief fad, I think it was 1862, to take waved braid, which is kind of like rickrack, but not, and use it to make a sort of lace that was then used in undergarments. I can always date a chemise that uses this because I've only seen directions for making up this type of trim once in a ladies magazine, and so it seemed to be a very short-lived fad, but I've seen, I think, 3 chemises with this particular style, which I think is significant considering the fact that I've only seen like maybe 60 chemises. So the fact that 3 of them are this one particular style, and they very much fit with that same look, like the yoke and all of that. I think it's hilarious that seemed to be a very popular, like, little thing to do. It seems like a lot of work. I haven't tried it. It's on my list of things to do one day. But I have to get really good waved braid, which is almost impossible to get nowadays. Rickrack, it's similar, but it's not quite the same shape, so I need to find some good vintage stock, and it will require a good length of yardage. But I do want to try that one day. And then I'm not sure exactly when it comes into style, but somewhere in the early to mid 1860s, we start to see what I call bibbed chemises. And that is another personal term. It's not a period one from what I know. It just makes sense to me. But I see them a lot in the 1860s. It's a variant of the straight yoke. but usually add what is usually a very highly decorated bib portion, like right here, and it's quite a lovely effect. I mean, I've not personally studied one of these in person. It's on my list of things because I would like to see the construction of it. I want to see if that bib flips up and it functions like the earlier 1830s and 1840s bib chemises, where you can put that bib over the corset, because I know a lot of people, even with the properly fitted corsets, have what is affectionately referred to in the hobby as the bow of a ship bosoms. Corset, raises your breast, and sometimes we have very rounded, large breasts, and that very sharp upturn of a corset, it does give bow of the ship when you look at it from the side. And a bib chemise would somewhat cover that and make them more rounded. And I really do wonder if that's part of what that style is about. But I haven't seen one, and I haven't seen pictures of one lifted up. So I'd like to know if they actually lift up or not. I assume they do, but I don't know. Oh, and another thing about construction. Somewhere in the mid-1850s, maybe the early 1850s to late 1840s, they figure out, in a very stroke of genius, how to cut the sleeve and gusset as one piece so that you don't have to sew a gusset into your sleeve every time. Because before this, we are always cutting sleeves and gussets very separately, but they figure out that if you add a little piece on the end of your sleeve, you can sew it up as one, and it has that roominess so you can still move freely with the gusset, so it's not super tight under your arm, but without extra sewing. And that is very genius. I have some mid-19th century chemises that have that feature and some that do not. It also eliminates all the bulkiness of the seams right there, which is also a very, again, cuts out work, but it also is it's also more comfortable. You again still see regular old gussets though, by cutting the sleeve and gusset as one piece is an option in this time period. So starting in the mid 1860s, we began to see those sleeves gradually getting shorter. A few inches long in 1860, they've been gradually shortening through the decades, just very, very gradually. Sleeves are now barely more than 2 or 3 inches from the shoulder, and at this point I rarely see gussets on the chemises. Chemises are more round, so you have to cut out an armhole out of your chemise body to put in your sleeves, as opposed to just having a few inches unsewn to insert the gusset as we have done previously. And this is the late 1860s we're talking about. Yokes, when used, are very narrow. We're talking about 1/2 inch to 1 inch is very popular, not like the 2 to 3 inch yokes of the late 1850s and early 1860s. I do tend to still see the rounded necklines in the 1870s. The puffed sleeve, which was used alongside the straight sleeve for the last 2 decades, is now basically entirely usurped by the straight sleeve. But yes, chemises still have sleeves. Up until the 1880s, all chemises have sleeves. Okay, there's no such thing as a ball gown chemise with no sleeve. There isn't. It doesn't exist. I don't know where that reenactorism came from, but I would like it to stop. It's just one of those things that just personally gets to me. I don't know why. It's not a big deal. I don't see them very much, but I see people talking about them. Oh, this is a ball gown chemise. That is not a thing. What you made there is an 1880 chemise, because that's when we start seeing no sleeves. The sleeveless look. Before then, if you had ball gowns with sleeves, you just made your chemise sleeves shorter, which they should be pretty short by this point anyway, so it's not really a big deal unless you're talking like the 1840s, which even then evening sleeves do come to cover where you would typically find a chemise sleeve ending, so you don't see the super short sleeves. Chemise sleeve styles do tend to match evening sleeve styles in the sense that even in the evening, a typical chemise should still be covered by an evening sleeve. So that's one of the things that you also do see change in fashion, is evening sleeves in the 1830s do tend to be giant puffs, but they tend to end about here, which is where the chemise sleeves are ending about an inch above. And evening sleeves tend to gradually get shorter and shorter and shorter until you hit like the 1860s when they're like right here. And chemise sleeves are again about an inch above that. So in my opinion, I haven't seen this written down, but a reason why the chemise sleeve styles do change is that fashion, the outer fashion, is changing slightly with evening styles, and you need to continually hide it. So the fashionable sleeve shape does correspond to the fashionable evening shape, at least through this general time period. So into the 1870s, chemises again do button up the front typically with again just 3 buttons, sometimes 2 buttons, especially if it's just a little tiny yoke. You'll see just 1 button or 2 buttons, and then a little slit down the center of the chemise, that way you can get it on and off. So with fitted bands from like the 1840s on, you do typically need a little bit more fitting options to get it on and off. You above shoulders, above bust, above hips, to get it on and off. So that's where the buttons and buttonholes come into play. Whereas before then, of course, we had the drawstrings that we could let out and let in. You also see a lot of very decorated chemises in the late 1860s and early 1870s. I did say we're going to get to 1880. So the 1870s due into 1880. So we're going to basically stop it there. We did talk a little bit about the 1880s style chemise, which is basically tends to be a little bit more sleeveless or very small sleeves. And they also tend to be, how do I put this nicely? Not as economical in how they cut their. So we start out in the 18th century where basically every piece of fabric is used. You have a giant rectangle of fabric and you're basically cutting all your pieces very geometrically to fit so where you use that exact length and there's no wastage. And as you move through the centuries, there's more and more waste created. And so by this point in time, it just seems like it's very normal to cut a straight chemise without, gores at the bottom. It is less sewing, I understand. So they didn't seem to care about fabric economy quite as much in that time period. But also you can use the scraps for other things, so it all ends up being used, I suppose, but it is interesting. But I think that's where we're going to leave off in this video because, again, I don't care for much after 1880. Things changed throughout that over 100-year time period that we looked at today. But we started with a white plant-based fiber garment that looked somewhat like a modern-day nightgown, and we ended with basically the same thing, but with lots of different styles and looks and design choices within, all guided by the all-knowing and powerful lady fashion. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research into shifts and chemises and how their styles changed. I had a lot of fun researching for this one, and I look forward to doing more. Next episode, we will be looking into 19th century advice to the married women, so that should be a fun one. Be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on YouTube or Instagram under the name Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, and if you did, please consider leaving me a review or comment on Spotify or YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me any topics you'd like me to cover on future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next episode.